Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome ever so much to the fourth in our Nobel Institute Spring Lecture Series. As noted last week, unfortunately Fabian Klose was unable to attend due to unforeseen circumstances. So on short notice, a political science professor from Uppsala, Joakim Palme, is here to enlighten us, I hope, on one of the most controversial issues in Europe today, I would say. That is the question of the economic crisis and future of social security. Joakim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Asle, and apologies for sort of disappointing you not being Fabian here. And also I have to say that when I got the invitation, I immediately checked the webpage of the Institute and identified a very nice and cozy seminar room, which I thought was the place where 8 or maximum 10 people would listen to my talk. Then saw this very impressive lecture room and feel a bit humbled here in the front. I have also to confess that I don't really match your expectations of hearing a lot about war and peace and things like that. But I will try to keep a broad perspective of social security and discuss that in the context of other aspects of security. And I'll try to discuss social security and other security in the light of different kinds of crises. Start with some historical reflection, and then my focus will be more around the current sort of aftermath of the global financial crisis in Europe, or how it's sort of landed in Europe, and also say something about a more recent crisis element associated with the big waves of refugee migration that we not least saw last year. And also that will be slightly European-centered, so you have to forgive me for that too. I think the social security issue, of course, goes back to Otto von Bismarck and the late 19th century and the threat of social unrest from the emerging industrial working class. But I also think that the Second World War was a very important moment in terms of raising the link between military security, political security, and social security. So I don't think it was a coincidence that the International Labour Organization was formed in 1919, and one of the major issues addressed in the journals of the Industrial Labour Organization was social security and its implication for peace and maintaining other aspects of security. So these kinds of military political crises can of course be linked then to the development of social security. And I also think that the 1930s saw two very important crises that were triggers of a changed understanding of the importance of public policy for promoting the economic security of individuals. And I'm thinking here of the rise of Keynesianism as a response to the employment crisis, to the deep economic recession. And Keynesianism was providing the economic rationale for political intervention that was aimed at sort of combating the economic crisis, and part of that became providing social security systems for not only old and sick people, but also for unemployed persons. I think perhaps the best experience of how that crisis sort of triggered social policy reform is the United States, where this became sort of part of the response to the deep economic crisis. I would also like to mention what in Sweden became labeled the crisis of the population question. And I do this not only because it's linked to two names that received eventually the Nobel Prize, namely Gunnar and Alva Myrdal. And Gunnar received the prize in economics in 1974, and Alva Myrdal received the Peace Prize here in Oslo in 1982. But what they did in the 1930s was to formulate or identify the crisis in the population development, in the sense that not only Sweden but many European countries saw falling birth rates, and that was seen as a national problem, as an economic problem, but by them also as a social problem. They saw it as a response of young families to poor social circumstances, that they didn't dare to have the number of children that they wanted. And as a response, they launched a program for facilitating family formation, not a pre-natalist response, as you saw in many other European countries, but an idea that public policy was aimed at sort of liberating and facilitating for families to have the number of kids they wanted. Also, the Second World War was really important for promoting social security thinking around the world. And I think that this was formulated by many interesting also scholars. Britain, which was often used as an example of a class society where inequalities are big, in the Second World War, I think changed the mindset of many politicians and opened up for comprehensive reforms of the British welfare state, not only the national health services, but also social insurance programs that were comprehensive. But the report that underlined the reform strategy in Britain was called Social Services in Full Employment Society. So also the employment issue was critical in that sort of, you could say perhaps social liberal vision of a modern welfare state. But we saw other attempts to unify social insurance systems in order to provide a more comprehensive protection of the population in a large number of European countries, also among the Nordic countries, of course. And in a way, one could see then the post-war development, the golden age of welfare capitalism, as a, so to speak, implementation of the political agendas that had been formulated as responses to the different crises in the 1930s. But with the increased economic powers and the ability to tax populations that had come out of the Second World War. We saw then 30 years of favorable economic development coupled with the expansion of social security for the majorities of European populations. But it came in a way to an end. At least the notion of a crisis re-emerged. And it re-emerged in the context of oil crisis. And the oil crisis triggered a crisis of employment, and the crisis of employment eventually created a crisis for for the welfare state. And the first sort of book on the welfare state in crisis came, I think, in 1980, published by the OECD. And it was focused on the unemployment problem, but I think it was an interesting analysis in the sense that it advocated that one should see economic and social policies together. So not seeing this in silos or compartment, but that we need to think about ways of combining economic and social objectives. And also very strong emphasis on the role of research and evaluation for guiding policy reforms. And I think of course, one of the prime problems of the time was inflation, which is not, at least not in this part of the world, a problem. Now we have a problem with deflation. But there was a sort of an ambition of changing our perspective of social policy and social security beyond redistribution, and looking at ways of sort of recreating full employment in order to sustain the social security systems and a welfare society, as it was labeled. Now, the oil crisis didn't hit this part of the world, Scandinavia, as much as other parts of Europe, even though if Denmark was clearly much more, part of the European scenario at the time. Now, things changed, growth picked up. Welfare states found it affordable to retire big parts of the older part of the labor force. But there were more crises to come, and in the 1990s there was again economic recession during the first part of that century. Sweden and Finland were particularly hard hit by the economic crisis, partly because of ill thought through domestic research agendas, but in the case of Finland also because of the downfall of the Soviet Empire and the economic repercussions that had for the country. Also, Sweden was hit by the fact that both UK and US export destinations of Swedish firms really had economic difficulties at the time. I was given the opportunity to do a study for the Council of Europe in the middle of the 90s, and the title of the study, I didn't decide that on my own. It was the politicians of the Council of Europe that decided it. And the title of the study was Welfare State in Crisis: How to Protect the Rights whilst Controlling the Costs. So no one wanted to change or reduce the welfare rights or social security, but they didn't want to increase the cost. They wanted to control the costs. And I consulted a political philosopher about how can we solve this trick of protecting rights and controlling the cost. And he said a bit jokingly that cheap rights are the cheap systems is the solution. But I think the sort of message of the study that we did, a European team, was that there is no other way of solving this equation than increasing the number of taxpayers. So you cannot protect rights unless and at the same time keeping costs down as if you don't increase the number of taxpayers. And the Nordic countries actually had done that trick before the 1990s with the expansion of female labor force participation. A dramatic change if you look at the development of just over a couple of decades. And my interpretation of that development was that it sort of public policies changed in a number of respects, and a bit perhaps not so simultaneously, but in sequence that was favored. And it started with the fact that women took part in the education system more and more, and eventually to the same extent as men. But their labor force participation was held back by the fact that so much of the caring responsibilities were put on the shoulders of women. And not only that, but also the tax systems were designed as being very progressive, which meant that if you had joint taxation, taxed the incomes of men and women at the same time, the second earner, the woman's income, would be taxed very, very high, given the progressivity of the tax scales. But when the Nordic welfare states were reformed, not only by providing elderly care and care for children, but also offering or changing the tax system to individual taxation, then the incentives were improved and the options for combining care and market work were improved. And this happened at the same time as employment opportunities increased by flourishing private sector, but also expanding public sector. Difference between Sweden and Norway in this respect was that Sweden imported a lot more labor at the time, which was not the case in Norway. I think that the lesson is that a lot of the discussion about the crisis of the welfare state was about how big the welfare state was, how impossible it was to combine high taxes with employment, but that a more careful analysis indicated that the issue is not about the level of taxation, the issue is about the design of the tax systems, and the issue is about making the social security systems work as promoters of employment, not to sort of pull people out of the labor market, as had been the case in many European countries as a response to the oil crisis. I think that starting in, not with this study, but with other kinds of analysis in the second part of the 1990s, there was a change of perspective and I think a quest or a demand for more precise analysis that went beyond old stereotypes of how we should look at economic and social policy. And in that respect, I think responding to what the OECD had demanded already in 1980. Now, I think the oil crisis and the crisis of the 1990s were sort of preludes to another crisis that had been spotted, and that was the aging crisis. And this had, of course, been on the radar of economists, demographers, eventually also international organizations. The World Bank came with a report in 1994 entitled "Averting the Old Age Crisis." And the message was that it's difficult to predict the future, but some things are more easy to predict than others. And we can predict the age structure pretty well, because we know who we are today, who is living here in this country, how old they are, and we know that they will get 1 year older each year. And then we can sort of make forecasts of how many that will be 80 and 90 years in 10 or 20 years' time. And this may be affected by migration or changes in mortality or fertility, but these processes are usually, these effects are usually small, so it cannot upset the general projections. And with a larger part of the population in old age, that will put a higher pressure on the working age population, because there would be more old people claiming pensions and health care and elder care and fewer workers. But the sort of underlying problem was, in a way, the same. And if we want to sort of then maintain social security systems, we have to face this reality that that social security systems are, to a large extent, redistributed over the life cycle, and changes in the population structure with more old people or more young people will put heavy pressure on the public finances, or heavy pressure on the family to deal with the increasing care responsibilities at both ends of life, both among the young and among the old. I think when I worked later at what's called the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm, with studies for the European Commission on the, how to design what was warranted as sustainable policies for aging societies. I think the expectation was that we would discuss a lot around how to organize pension systems or how to organize healthcare systems. But our main message was that we can forget about pension systems and healthcare systems unless we can have good policies for reproducing the future tax base, the future resource base for managing redistributive systems like pension systems or healthcare systems. And this should engage us not primarily with policies aimed at the old, but with policies aimed at the young, or policies aimed at promoting a sustainable population development, aimed at facilitating fertility, facilitating labor supply, and of course education became one of the core elements in that sort of message to the European Commission at the time. And I think this has then been echoed in many other studies, and I think it's important to then also learn the lesson from the European laboratory, because we have now in Europe countries that have pursued very different policies in different areas, and we can evaluate or study, analyze the results of different policy regimes. And in the education area, it's clear that there are big differences in terms of how much European countries have invested in the education system at large during the post-war period. And there's also a very clear correlation between how much you invest in education and how growth rates have been performing today. So we need to, I think, thinking about how, again, research can be used for analyzing the preconditions for various aspects of security. I think the interesting thing with the European Union is that it produces a lot of interesting rhetoric, a lot of interesting agendas. And you may remember the Lisbon agenda, which was formulated around the turn of the millennium, which was to set out a bright future for the European Union, to be the most competitive economy in the world, and producing more and better jobs and social cohesion and so on. And of course, the end result was going to be produced in 2010, and then came the global financial crisis. And of course, the goals would not have been reached even if the crisis had not come, but it was clear that the global financial crisis sort of torpedoed the fairly favorable development that came in many European countries. Also in the relationship to the extension of the European Union to the former Central European countries. So it's clear that this economic crisis was jeopardizing not only the goals, but it was also a clear trigger of not only a crisis in the financial system, but eventually a crisis in the really economic system, and it started to create an employment crisis. And in a way, I think in retrospect, there was, at least initially, a response from the European Union, and a response also from other political leaders that were aimed at really promoting both economic and social goals. So you may remember that Obama extended the unemployment insurance. There were similar policy measures taken in the European Union, and the idea was to protect those who had been hit by this economic crisis. But it was also rediscovery of the Keynesian approach, meaning that the economy can benefit from having automatic stabilizers that can maintain the demand in the economy and avoid that the economy is sort of spiraling downwards. Now, I think the initial response was then seen as problematic when the public finances, or the status of the public finances, started to deteriorate. And when what we saw then was that the divergence of economic development in all respects increased, so that differences between European countries increased a lot. These sort of initial ambitions to combine these economic policies was then jeopardized by the fact that countries were forced to impose strict policies in order to maintain or recover from unbalanced public finances. Now, I will talk about two kinds of responses that I think are relevant in terms of looking at how the crisis has triggered interesting new initiatives from the European Union. They may be seen as unrealistic, but I think that in terms of analysis they make sense. And one, the responses was formulated during the previous commission, the commission that retired now 2 years ago. I think an important actor here was the Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs, Laszlo Andor. And he left two ideas behind him. One idea was to use unemployment insurance on a European level as a way of dealing with the fact that if you have a monetary union, as well, Norway and Sweden are not member of the monetary union, but many European countries are. If you are a member of a monetary union, then you cannot use monetary policies to deal with economic shocks. And because the economic shocks were hitting countries very differently, it meant that those who were affected very badly were constrained. They could not respond to that situation. So they started to spiral downwards. Their economic conditions deteriorated. So the proposal from Andor was to actually have European-wide or a Eurozone-wide component in unemployment insurance that could sort of cushion future external shocks to the economy. And I think that is a correct analysis, and I've been involved in studies comparing the unemployment insurance systems in European member states. And it's clear that at least among the members of the Eurozone, that the systems are fairly similar. So you can, with small adjustments, make them very similar. And with the same kinds of system, you could also think about having a European or Eurozone-wide economic mechanism, so that countries who are not hit by unemployment during one shock will help to bolster the effect of countries that are hit harder. And by that, you can both combine the social objectives of protecting workers with the economic objectives of not getting, the European Union to spiral downwards in terms of economic development. And I think it's clear that many countries in the European Union still struggle and are still on an economic level that is below the situation before the Lehman crisis. And this might be something we forget in this part of the world. The second legacy of the former Commission was labeled as the social investment package by Andor. And this was, again, an ambition to combine economic thinking with social objectives. And I think it sort of harks back to the Myrdal agenda in terms of focusing on sort of investment in the population as a sort of approach for dealing with not only the global or the economic crisis or the Lehman Brothers crisis, but also dealing with the challenges of the aging crisis. And in a way, using the crisis to sort of think in new terms, and also perhaps using the prolonged time horizon of politicians induced by the focus on climate change, and thinking about policies that are not giving returns within the present, before next election, but the policies that are important in the longer term for next generation. What is then meant by the social investment package? Well, it starts from an analysis of the economy on an individual level, thinking about our life as an economic life cycle. And as individual, we are sort of born with unable to support ourselves. So we have to rely on our family to get fed and housed, and eventually we will be depending on the public sector or NGOs for providing education and training, so that we eventually can step out on the labor market and become sort of net contributors to society. And then if we're lucky, we can stay long at the labor market, and if we're well educated, we can give good returns, not only to ourselves, but also to society. And if we're really well trained, we can continue to work longer. And if you're a professor, you're supposed to never retire, to continue to work. But the point here is that an economic life cycle can only be sustained and long working life if you do the investments right from the beginning. And this is not only thinking about investing in future university students, but picking up a broader notion of human capital formation that has been emerging under the label of skill formation. So we have human capital, we have skills that are important. They may not always be academic skills, but other skills. But they're incredibly important for our ability to sustain a long working life. And it's also about then the distribution of human capital. So we should not only worry about the elite, but worry about the majority of the population. And if unemployment today is a problem primarily for the low educated, well then a response could be to educate people so that their skills can match the demands on the labor market. And the social investment package outlines a policy package that goes sort of basically from the cradle to the grave, that are supposed to include policy interventions that can be helpful. So we're talking about early childhood education, we're talking about regular schools, but we're also talking about improved education to prepare people for working lives, improve their skills, or for that matter, maybe for university education. And then thinking about that not as people are fully trained for a long working life, but that we need to take the notion of lifelong learning seriously, so that we think about also organizing workplaces so that they become places where you actually learn more things. And the Danish economist Bengt-Åke Lundvall has labeled this the learning economy. I think this is also important to reflect on if we want to take the opportunity of a crisis and sort of invent new policy packages. So here we have two interesting legacies, I think, from the European side in terms of thinking how we can respond to the present economic crisis in ways that are compatible with the need to respond to the long shadow of the aging crisis. Let me, from that, sort of go to the final policy area or final crisis that has been labeled as the refugee crisis. But I think it's important to put that into perspective and put it into a perspective of global population development. We know from historical analysis that we can predict migration from the way that the population structure looks. In the sense that if a country has a young population, many between 20 and 30, then you're likely to see a lot of outward migration. This was the case among the Nordic countries in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This is true when we look at parts of Asia today, or the Middle East, North Africa. And what we see today globally is that 250 million people are international migrants, something like that. And of those, about 60 million are refugees. So we have globally maybe large number of the population but the important thing here is that the international migration has been on the same level for about a century. And on the same level, I mean that about 3% of the world population has been international migrants. So the fact that we have much more migrants now is a reflection of the fact that our population, global population, has increased. And then, of course, we have the refugees, and they are refugees because there are violent conflicts or oppression. And I think it's important to recognize what researchers like Henrik Udal here in Oslo has pointed to, that you also have an increased risk of conflict when you have young migrant-prone populations. So it's not a coincidence that we have a lot of political unrest in North Africa or Middle East, given the population structure. But where the conflicts will appear is, of course, much more difficult to predict. Now, of the 60 million refugees that we have globally, 1 million has sort of landed last year in Europe. And that, of course, is not a huge number in the global perspective, but it's record high in terms of the European experience. And most of them are from Syria, but there are also substantial number of refugees coming from Afghanistan, either directly or via other countries in the regions. And the conflict in Iraq also continues to generate many refugees. Most of the refugees in Syria are internal refugees. They are refugees in their own country. And of those who go internationally, most of them go to countries close. So we have millions of refugees in Lebanon, which is a small country, and millions of refugees in Turkey, and Turkey is a big country. But they have, I think, double the number of refugees that come to the European Union. So in a way, one can sort of have good reasons for putting the numbers in perspective here. Of course, the way that the refugees come to Europe is dramatic, and we see that thousands of persons die in small boats on the sea, and it's of course a threat to human security. Not only the boat trips, but the entire flight is a threat to human security. That has been identified in many contexts, in many reports, and it's then clear that this refugee crisis has also become a crisis for European cooperation. So, while the European Union has set up a system for dealing with refugees and migration, the system has, by and large, broken down after the large numbers that came last year. And little by little, the European Union is trying to rebuild that system. And of course, including controversial measures such as the deal with Turkey, that some claim come into the conflict of the international conventions that the members of the European Union, the member states have signed, such as the Geneva Convention. But it's clear that it's attempts to redraw the architecture with the aim not only to reduce the number of refugees, but also to increase the human security dimension here. Of course, we can then see the refugee crisis also as a crisis for the welfare state. And 20 years ago, Gary Freeman wrote that ultimately national welfare state cannot coexist with the free movement of labor. And I think that he would include refugee migration into this context. And here, I think the research gives different indications. So there are a number of studies that indicates that the international migration and refugee migration has, in a number of instances, meant that the support for social security systems diminish. Yet it's difficult to see that it has substantially reduced the support for social security when we compare different countries. And in effect, we see that also the most sort of generous welfare states behave or let me put it this way. When we look at the most generous welfare states, we also see that these are the states that accept the largest number of forced migrants, asylum seekers. So Scandinavian countries are among the most generous welfare states. They also accept the largest number of refugees. And if Freeman is right that this is undermining the welfare state, then it's sort of a self-reinforcing or self-eroding process that is now going on. And if you look at, there have been strong reactions of so far political minorities against these policies. But by and large, it's difficult to see that the increased heterogeneity in the Nordic countries has reduced the support for paying taxes or for the social security system. So I think that we're now in the middle of a sort of experiment, and we don't have we cannot supply the final answers. But I think that there are reasons to question Freeman's sort of very strong claim that you cannot combine migration with sustaining a welfare state. But I think that, again, we have then to ask ourselves what kind of policies can be favorable. And I'm thinking here about the fact that migration is potentially a threat to the security, not only of migrants, it's maybe also a threat to the security of those who remain in the country of origin. It may be a threat to the security of the populations in the receiving countries, unless we pursue policies that are favorable in terms of integrating the migrants. And I'm now thinking about integration at large in society, but not least in on the labor market. So in that respect, I think that we're talking about the aging crisis, we're talking about the financial crisis, and we're talking about the refugee crisis. And I think that the kinds of challenges that these crises produce have a number of common denominators. And I think the balance of taxpayers and benefit receivers is one issue. And I think how to rethink economic and social objectives is another one. And I think that if we're looking at the Lisbon agenda, or for that matter, the agenda that EU issued after the Lisbon agenda, the EU 2020, the kinds of core objectives that you find there are relevant for all these kinds of challenges. And at top of the agenda is social cohesion. And social cohesion is difficult to define. It sounds great. Everyone wants. I don't know what the Norwegian exact concept is, but sammanhållning in Swedish. And I've heard political leaders from all the political parties in Sweden saying that they want social cohesion. But I think my concluding message here is that you will not produce social cohesion unless you are serious about social investment. And I'm thinking about investment broadly in the population. Because if you invest in the skills of people, then you will increase the chances of the individuals, be it a migrant or a native, to be integrated in different spheres of society, to be socially included. And if we are socially included in different spheres of society, then we can enhance what political scientist Robert Putnam has coined the social capital. And social capital is that we have social relations crisscrossing in society. We're not living in a ghettoized society, but have social relations across different boundaries. And only if we do that right, I think that we can make a strong case for actually being successful in coming closer to more social cohesion. And I think in this endeavor, I think another challenge is to accept that we may come from different cultures, but that we have a common interest in civic integration, a social integration that can be a benefit for everyone. Now, of course, the refugee crisis is not the last crisis. There'll be more crises in the future. And there was one Swedish skier who once said, it's never too late to give up. But we might also consider the alternatives of if it gets more difficult, we could perhaps try even harder and act wiser, and in that respect, respond to a different crisis by improving different aspects of security and not seeing them eroded. So thank you very much for your attention.
As usual, we will now have a 5-minute break, chance to go to the bathroom or to get some more coffee, and then we will rejoin for questions and answers. Plenty of controversial topics to discuss here. Thank you so much, Professor Palme.
Thank you.
In your talk, you made a suggestion which I found to be both genuine, innovative, and quite provocative, the notion of internationalizing the welfare state. Later in your lecture, you pointed out the challenge of diverging societies, heterogeneous societies. How do you see this play out in Europe? Do you think that it is politically feasible to rescue the welfare state, if you will, in this way?
Well, I don't know if it's enough to do this to rescue the welfare state, but and it might not be politically feasible either, because as we talked about here in the break, there's a strong tension between sort of our understanding of what the welfare state is and in my view, the challenges coming from international migration and need to provide security systems also for the migrants. But in a way, I think we can look back at successful examples, and in the Nordic countries, we have had not only a free labor market, but also coordinated social protection systems for more than half a century. And that has worked well. It has not undermined our welfare states. Of course, for each welfare state, there is a cost of paying a pension to a former worker that has moved back. I mean, in the Swedish case, to the tens of thousands of Finns who've moved back to Finland after having spent their work life in Sweden. And you will pay pensions to all these young Swedes who work in the service sector here, not only in Oslo, but also elsewhere. That will be a cost, but it will be a manageable cost. There are some special tensions around the fact that in the European Union we also have a free movement of labor, and we also have rules and regulations say that the migrant workers should have the right to earn the rights and bring it back home when you move. And if you're working in different countries, you should not only earn your entitlements, you should also get the pension once you retire from the different workplaces. And I think that is also manageable and fine, but the problem is that we have so different traditions, different ways of funding our systems, and that creates tensions and problems. These asymmetries make it possible for individuals and for firms and even for countries to manipulate the system so that someone else pays for the earned rights of workers. And also, I mean, considering the huge income differences between Eastern Europe and North or West Europe. Take the example of a Lithuanian construction worker who works and pays tax in Sweden, but has a family with children back home. The value of the family benefits that he would earn entitlements to is, of course, much higher in Lithuania than in Sweden. And that can mean that this is putting a wage pressure so that he could probably work for free because the incomes of his family will be improved by the fact that he's a worker. Now, if you look at the size of the family benefits going to the Baltic countries from Sweden, it's not big numbers, but it's just an illustration of the kinds of tensions that can come from this. But of course, the world is bigger than Europe, and I think I was discussing a bit around the possibility of having a common financial mechanism for running the unemployment insurance systems in the Eurozone. And I think that may be politically feasible, but I think it makes a lot of sense in economic terms. What also makes sense in economic terms is, I think, to have international systems for bringing back pensions for those who come from outside the European Union. Because now it's dependent a lot on bilateral agreement between countries. But if we're thinking of migration in this bigger perspective, migration is 250 million people. The money that the migrants send back to their home countries is several times the total aid money that comes from the states. And this has a potential of funding development in the poorest part of the world. And of course, that is important, but it's also important to, I think, secure the economic situation, because here we're looking at often the lowest paid workers in European countries, and that they should have a secure pension once they want to go home after they retire. And that could also be a continuation of sort of funding variation. So I think that, take for example the Swedish pension system. We have 6 million accounts on a big computer, managing every month you work and you pay your contribution, and that's registered. The Swedish system is also partly funded, so you can choose a fund manager on the private market. I could imagine that we could have a global system, not with 6 million, but 6 billion pension accounts that could provide security for the migrant workers. And I'm not now talking about the rich university professors that sort of are global migrants, but about domestic workers, about low-paid people. So I think that there are options for thinking more globally around these systems of social protection. And if you're organizing them in this way, I cannot see that this is threatening the finances of the systems. I think it, on the contrary, it can contribute to sustain the tax base, not only for the pension systems, but also for other. But I think then of course we need to start to change our way of thinking about the welfare state as not only a national project, but about the project that has different kinds of international dimensions. It was easier with the Nordic countries. It was possible with Europe, and I think there are good reasons for extending that perspective. Yeah, but there might be other questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Christopher Lee. I think this is a very interesting debate. But why is this a very difficult topic? This is my neutral question for you.
Do you mean the issue of protecting migrant workers, or?
No, the whole debate. Why is it so debate a very difficult topic?
Migration or the security?
Yes, with this last thing you said. Why is it so difficult debate?
Yeah, it's. I think it's difficult because the facts are complicated. I think it's also. I mean, you really had to study the systems carefully to understand where the problems are. also think it's difficult because there are a lot of fears around migration and such. So I think that when we study or discuss different issues around migration, this triggers a lot of fears. But also, I think, fears for more migration, fears what that would mean to society, but also fears among those who is in favor of a generous asylum policy, but also think that there might be hidden costs here, and if they are exposed, then that could result in a more restrictive asylum policy, for example. So I think that there are a lot of fears and emotions around this that are natural, but I think that it can help if we put the facts on the tables, the numbers on the tables. Not arguing that the issue of asylum policy should be an economic calculus. We have signed Norway and Sweden and other European countries and most countries in the world the Geneva Convention that obliges us to protect people. But I think that a lot of emotions around these issues and more facts can maybe help to reduce the emotional level, so to speak.
Thank you. Yes, I must confess this is the most optimistic and refreshing talk I have heard in quite some time. And you ended on an exuberant note when you mentioned the 6 billion pension accounts.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Very different perspectives. But I have my doubts about some of these perspectives. Your historical development is that we have faced all these challenges. And we've handled them pretty well, one after another. And these challenges, they have been huge. They have been very difficult. Yeah. But your conclusion is that, yeah, we handled them all. Maybe so. But if you look at the growth rate, we had the glorious 30 years after 1945, and then the oil shock. And yes, we did to some extent recover, but the growth rates did decline very substantially. So something has happened to the international economy after the oil crisis of the 70s compared to the glorious 30 years. So that's one example. The other example is that I think you argued about the refugees that, yes, the countries with the best social security systems, they accept the highest number of refugees. Well, you're being very generous to Finland and Denmark, I think. It's true in Sweden and maybe to some extent in Norway, but the jury is still out on this. We see very interesting or disconcerting developments, definitely in Norway, and I'm pretty sure also in Sweden and Germany and other countries. So I would be very hesitant to make any sort of conclusion on this point. But my really question is, the underlying factor, which you stressed all through all this, is employment.
Yeah.
Employment is the key. We have to provide employment. But how does your crystal ball look? Because on the one hand, we do have very considerable unemployment in many European countries. We do have a growing refugee population, which may lead to considerable difficulties on the labor market. We have the new technology. We read endless articles about how the new technology will diminish the need for labor. On the other hand, the big factor on the other side is the low birth rate in many countries and the declining birth rate. So how do you figure this one out? What does your crystal ball look like? Thank you for a very refreshing and stimulating talk.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, to start with, I would not be sort of naively optimistic and tell you that we will have a fantastic growth rate in the future, at least not in this part of the world. So I think the aging of our populations will have a depressing factor on the growth rates. But the good news is that it's growth rates from levels of economic development that are already high. So we will be much richer in the future, but the growth rates are such. But 1.5% growth rates, given the economic development we have now, means a lot over a decade. Second issue is then unemployment, and I mean, I agree. This is the big issue. I think the big issue, both in terms of sustaining generous and equality-promoting security systems, but also in terms of dealing with civic integration versus multiculturalism. And I think that we have problems here. We discussed here in the break here that the fact that Norway is more successful in terms of employing the second generation migrants, but that might also be due to the fact that your macroeconomy has been going much better than the neighboring countries. I think that we should probably be realistic in two respects. It will take time to get the newcomers onto the labor market, but that we should not be pessimistic about the long-term possibilities, but that it will depend on what kind of investment we do in this part of the population. And I mean, sometimes in my country there's a sort of complaint about the fact that immigrant women work much less than Swedish women, and this is a correct description, but it's also true that I think Somali women in Sweden have a higher employment rate than Italian women in Italy. So it's not that it's completely sort of impossible, and I think that if we are really serious about our values, I think that there are good reasons for seeing both good economic and social returns on more investment in education of also the women in the immigrant population. You're worrying about the technology development and the robots and that the fact that jobs will disappear. And I think that I mean, this is a warranted concern, but we've seen that many times over again, which sort of reminds me of this Swedish trade union movement used to pursue a kind of neo-Schumpeterian economic policies, which meant that they supported the structural transformation by pushing up wages so that the inefficient firms would go bankrupt, and then the efficient firms would make profits, and the profits would be invested in new jobs, and with retraining of workers, they would find a place in the new, more efficient structures. And I think this is the sort of Nordic recipe, and why the Nordic populations are much more positive to globalization and competition, because they see that there's this constant structural transformation. But if education policy is good, if active labor market policy is actually retraining, the jobs are better in the new structures. to remind you of I used to be a pessimist. So 20 years ago, I gave a talk to the Swedish Social Policy Association, and among the listeners were one of the founding fathers of this trade union strategy, the Swedish labor economist Rudolf Meidner, who was always seen as a big pessimist, and he came after my talk and said, there was nothing new in what you said, nothing. I've heard this over and over again. You have all these crises, and somehow we muddle through, and it might be the end this time with the deep economic crisis that Sweden was facing in the mid-1990s. But I wouldn't bet any money on that. So I think we'll pull through again. So I think that, and this is perhaps related also to the sustainability concept, which was coined by the Brundtland Commission and has, I think, won a lot of attention and increasingly so outside the ecological field. And often politicians say that the situation is unsustainable. And I say that any situation is unsustainable unless you're willing to adapt and change and reform. Pension systems will go bankrupt if you don't adapt to changing circumstances. Refugee policy will not survive unless you will adapt to changing realities. So I think that critical thing is our ability to adapt and maybe I couldn't refrain from looking in the yearbooks of the Nobel Prize, and Gunnar Myrdal in his Nobel talk was dealing with the issue of inequality, and he was very optimistic about the prospects of using research and science in order to find new ways of promoting equality and reducing inequalities. Alva Myrdal was, in her talk, much focused on the threat of technology and, of course, nuclear armament and so on. So I think that, of course, there are threats to new technology also in terms of, it may increase inequalities. But again, I think it's about how we respond with policies that can modify the outcomes of that.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in a big round of applause for Professor Palme. We have to cut it off now because Norwegians get terribly anxious when we run over time. It has been stimulating, and I think we all learned something here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.